I'm recording now. Recording in progress. All right, welcome everyone. If you have a question for any of us, go ahead and leave it in the chat and we will be monitoring that over the course of the program and we will get to as many questions as we can. At this time, if you would go, I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone. If you have your video on, if you would please do us a favor and turn it off. And usually if you need help figuring out how to do that, let us know. We'll help you with that. But it should be a button at the bottom of your screen that says stop video, and that's the way to turn your video off. It should be right in the middle. And it'll say stop video. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. I'm Christina. I work with Fort Bend County Libraries, and I thank all of you for coming to join us today for the Landscape Success Program. Now, good afternoon. This is the Gardening Success Begins with the Soil. This is part 1 of the Landscape Success series, and we will have more about that in just a moment. Today, our presenter is Boone Holladay. He's a county extension agent from Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. He holds an undergrad degree in horticulture from Stephen F. Austin State University and a master's degree in agricultural education from Texas A&M University. Long before attaining these degree titles, he was an avid gardener and a young plant enthusiast. He brings previous experience as horticulture staff at Moody Gardens in Galveston. Producers Cooperative in Bryan and Texas A&M Horticulture in College Station. Having work experience in many horticulture areas and industry, from retail horticulture to landscape design and irrigation installation, he brings that knowledge paired with enthusiasm into Fort Bend County programming efforts. And on top of that, it was his birthday yesterday, so please join me in wishing him happy birthday.
Thank you.
Okay, and now we are doing this in partnership with the Fort Bend Master Gardener. So Suma, if you could tell us a little bit more about the upcoming series. Oh, Suma, you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you all for being here today. We are going to do this in a 8-part series. And these classes will take you step by step on how to be a successful home landscaper. So you can learn how to do it yourself and learn the basic fundamental things that will help you make your landscape a beautiful, sustaining landscape. So the next 8 classes all these classes will be on Tuesdays from 2 to 3:30, and we have 1 class for each month. So this is the first class, and the next one will be choosing right plants for the right place, and that's going to be on May 25th. The third class is on June 22nd, using irrigation wisely. July 20th, successful home composting. August 24th, understanding the lawn. September 21st, controlling landscape pests and diseases. October 26th, fruit trees for the backyard. November 16th, tree care basics. So we are covering all the aspects of your home landscape, and you can register 1 month in advance, like Christina said, and you will be, once you register, you will get reminders. So we will see you in each of these classes. And if you have any questions, put them in the chat and one of us will try to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, Boone, please take it away.
Yeah, we're ready to roll. Fantastic. Thanks, Suma, for that. And I will reiterate just a little bit on that we've developed this 8-class series to really try to cover all the topics in home, garden, and landscape management. And we've last couple years we've done this series with 6 classes. We've added 2 more to this to make it what we consider fully well-rounded and covering everything from turf grass to irrigation, trees, shrubs, annuals, perennials, fertilization, insect and disease management. So we've got it all built into the program. So what we hope is that you try to attend uh, all the classes if you can, or at least the majority of them. And if you do that, then I think you'll reap the benefit more than just attending one. So we're going to start today, and basically the class today is just talking about soil health, organic matter in the soil, and fertility, and how to manage soil fertility. So this one is kind of what we consider ground level, no pun intended, but all the stuff that we need to understand first to ensure landscape success. If we have issues with the soil, imbalances in the pH or soil nutrients, then that tends to be the root to a lot of our problems. I'm full of all these garden puns today. I guess maybe starting with our little joke session, it got me started off right. So I'm going to try to share my screen, and I'll get the PowerPoint started here if I can get to it. There it is. Let's see. No audio coming through there. Let's see. Let's see. So are we good? Can you hear me?
I can hear, but some of the people are saying there is no audio. Peggy also says there's no audio.
Boone, I can hear you fine.
Fantastic.
I can
Yeah,
hear you too.
that might just be an individual with the computer. Make sure your audio settings are enabled. Some people may have unintentionally turned their speakers off instead of just muting their microphones. So
Yeah. Okay.
I hope
I see
that's
a lot of people saying they can hear. Okay.
good deal. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about within the program is this Earthkind Landscaping, and this is a program that is developed by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension in partnership with Aggie Horticulture, or the Texas A&M University Horticulture Department, where we developed a framework of principles that guide gardening and home landscaping in a way that not only helps us achieve beautiful landscapes at home that are easy to maintain, but also to do it in a way that, um, we're being ethical with our decisions in the home landscape, and that we're keeping our environment and local ecosystems in mind with what we're doing. So these are the basic principles of the Earthkind program: planning and design, practical turf areas, appropriate plant selection, soil improvement, uh, efficient irrigation and rainwater catchment or rainwater harvesting, use of mulches or other organic additives, and then appropriate maintenance of those landscapes. And trying to do all these principles in a way that we minimize potential runoff of home garden chemicals into our water supply, doing it in a way that provides a habitat for naturally existing wildlife in our home landscapes, doing it in a way that decreases pest and disease pressure, um, and lessens the amount of plant material that we're having to take out of the garden and put into landfills, etc. So trying to address some big real world issues that we're dealing with in a way that is practical for people at their home level. So again, we're going to be talking about soil today primarily, and the fact that this isn't dirt, that we're talking about soil, and soil is the parent material, which is mineral deposits, mixed with a whole lot of life forms that is our building blocks for life on the planet. So obviously we would want to nurture that at our home level. And so just a quick breakdown here that shows you soil breakdown. This is a good pie graph of what soil is, and we've got about half of that is minerals. And this is rock deposits. That's either sand, silt, clay, loam. We've got organic matter, which is carbon-based material from dead and decayed once living organisms. And then the other half of our soil is air pockets, and half of that is active air, and we want about another half of that to be filled up with water. And so that's a perfect blend right there of soil that we would want in our home landscapes. So a couple of little maps. So I've got some overlays of some Texas maps here just to kind of break this down for us. First one here is our Texas elevation map, and you can see the dark green along the coast. And as we move up towards the Panhandle and El Paso, we get higher and higher in altitude. And so what this really shows us is, with the topography, it has defined our soil types here. And all this is minerals that have eroded down either through wind or shifts in ocean level or rivers that have moved sediment off of the highland areas and deposited that down along the coast where we're at. So that's really what has defined our soil basin along the coast right here. Is most of our soil here was originally way up here, and then through millions of years it has just eroded down towards the sea level, and that's what we get. So we don't have a whole lot of large rock, big mineral pieces. Everything that's been decomposed by wind and rain has ended up depositing and creating the layers of soil that we have here along the coast. So if we overlay this annual Texas rainfall map on top of that, we see that we're right in here, and so we're in one of the wettest areas in the state, which also helps us define our soil, and that our flat topography and a lot of annual rainfall for us, typically about 48 inches of rain a year on average, makes for a soil that is pretty flat, tends to be compacted, and tends to be saturated in moisture a lot of time throughout the year. And that does have an impact on the quality of our landscaping at home, being in an area where we do get so much rainfall, and a lot of times our soils are very saturated, and with that saturation comes a lack of air or oxygen in the soil profile. So again, this one is just a little bit better diagram of all the mineral deposits throughout the state. So you see there's quite a range, but along the coast here, these rainbows of oranges and reds suggest that all the soils that we have along the coast are basically deposits that have been deposited through time as the ocean level has risen and fallen up and back down. That would suggest that right along here, we have the smallest particles, clay particles, clay loam that has just gradually moved its way down and collected along the coast. So I don't want to have to beat up any type of soil, because each soil type has its beneficial characteristics. And so this is really this triangle that really breaks down all types of naturally occurring soils, where we have 100% clay, we have silt, and we have sand. And then we have all the combinations of those three that really define our soil type within those parameters. Suma, do we have any questions so far?
No, we don't have any questions so far.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we've got 2 stars on the map right here. And one is really this spot I've chosen on here is really where our soils tend to be here in Fort Bend County. Our naturally existing soils are very clayey. This is either a Houston profile or a Victoria profile clay, which is that black, grayish. Um, um, is that black clayish, heavy clay that most of us deal with. And this right here, if I had to choose a soil that I thought was great for gardening in, I'm gonna say, well, it might be over here is where I'd want to be at as far as the soil profile. Clays are great. If we look at like our row crop agriculture in Fort Bend County, where we have cotton, corn, grain sorghum, etc., it's all clay soil. And the good thing with that is one, it holds nutrients very well. It's kind of like a sponge. It holds everything in place. And also with water, it holds water really well. So in between rain, it doesn't dry out. It can hold that water for long periods of time. And so for using crops that you cannot irrigate or it's difficult to irrigate, then a clay soil is what you'd want to have. When you get more to these soils here that are higher in sand, the loams, then we get into some problems periodically when it starts getting dry and droughty outside that we have to irrigate those soils to have adequate moisture. And a lot of the nutrients tend to leach out with rainfall in more of a sandy profile. So we have to fertilize more often, or we have to add composts to the soil, etc. So just a pretty good diagram for you to think about when you're digging up your soil out of your landscape to try to identify. If you have clay, then it means you probably don't need to fertilize as much, or you don't need to water as much. If you have more of a sandy loam soil, well, then that might be an area where you're going to have to apply more regular landscape irrigation to keep the plants healthy. So a good way that we can kind of define this on our own without being a soil scientist is just a simple water infiltration or a percolation test. So you can take any type of a structure that holds water and poke a couple holes in the bottom of it and fill that up on just the naked soil and let it gradually drain out on its own. And so if you have a clay soil, then the wetting pattern on the soil is going to look like this picture. And it's also going to look like the diagram here on the right-hand side. It's going to look more like a pancake. When that water starts leaching out, it doesn't have capillary action to go down quickly. It starts spreading out laterally across the surface. So if you put this out and you see this large area of moisture, then you know, one, that you've got heavy clay soil, and also that your drainage is going to be pretty bad in the soil. So that may be something that you have to think about with improving the soil or implementing some type of a auxiliary drainage in the landscape. For a sandy soil, if I put this water here, I might see a little bit of moisture around the sides of it, but more than likely that water is just going to go down and it looks more like a carrot root than it does a pancake like this one does here. So that's just it's an easy way to test your soil type, not only how we fertilize it, but how we water that landscape as well is going to be defined based off of the soil texture. So kind of going along with that, we see a soil here on the left with what we would call good soil structure. And this has loose aggregate material in here. And this would be similar to a loam or a sandy loam soil where we have a lot of oxygen and pores throughout the soil so that when we do get rainfall, that water is able to penetrate down into the soil and we have oxygen down in the root system as well. This one here is more like our soils more commonly. It's heavily compacted, heavy clay soils that there's not a whole lot of porosity in here. And so when we do get rainfall, most of that rainfall uh, shears off the surface, ends up going into the street and the gutter instead of percolating down into our soil where we want it. Peggy, how we doing on questions there? I'm sorry, Suma.
We don't have any soil specific questions so far, some technology
Yeah.
questions. And somebody wanted to know if we make the recordings available later, but I'm going to check with Mac on that.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So we see these two pictures here, which would be pretty common for our area, and this suggests soil organic matter. If we dig a hole in the lawn here, and we dig down about a foot, 16 inches deep, this is what we hope to see is this dark layer that gradually becomes lighter as we get down to the parent material of the soil. And this looks like here is a blend of some limestone, caliche material, and clay, which is not the best soil, but we see here we've got a depth of 3 feet of organic matter in the soil. So that's pretty good, and that's going to allow oxygen and water to percolate down the soil and then allow those roots to go down into the soil as well. The picture on the left, you see here, we just don't see any organic matter in here. This is a caliche sand type soil. And then if we get down lower, we see some rust. If we see rusty red color, it means a couple things. One is that it has iron oxide in the soil, and it's basically is rust. But it also means that there's not much oxygen down into the subsoil here. So we want to find ways to incorporate organic matter down into the soil, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So I'm bringing up organic matter quite often in this presentation, and so basically the difference between organic matter and humus is that humus tends to be naturally occurring material in the soil. So if we go to a prairie or a forest, this is all the material that as trees and other plants and animals have died and have decomposed into the soil, then this layer that you get here is the humic layer or humus, and that's just naturally occurring. The organic matter is all the stuff that goes into that naturally within a system. So if we have a forest, we have this cycle of trees growing, germinating, living their life, dying, falling on the forest floor, and becoming part of that cycle. But when we get into a home landscape, we have to start thinking a little philosophically about this because we don't have that cycle anymore. We don't have that naturally occurring cycle of animals dying and decomposing, trees and other plants dying and decomposing to create more source of organic matter. So without us being meaningful and inputting new organic matter, then within some amount of time, the organic matter or the humus layer will go away. And with that being gone, with no humic layer and no organic matter in the soil, then we don't have the ability for microorganisms and macroorganisms, which would be earthworms and beetle larvae and other insects, to create a balance of nutrients naturally in the soil. So then we have a problem where we have to add all the nutrients. If we have organic matter in the soil, then all these microbes help add that organic matter for us and help add the nutrients naturally. So we want this, and we have to constantly strive to find ways to add
What?
new organic matter.
No.
We have a question?
Why?
No question.
No, somebody was unmuted, so I muted them.
Oh, Michael, cool. All right.
And
So
Boone, since we have an interruption, somebody was asking how to improve the drainage in clay soil.
very good. Yeah, I'll get to that here in a little bit, but
Yeah, okay.
basically it's going to be through aeration and the addition of compost onto the soil profile after you've aerated. And that's the most easy and first step process. Further than that, it's the regular addition of compost and mulches into the landscape, and that gradually, as that is decomposed, that earthworms and sows and pill bugs and earwigs and fire ants and springtails and termites, all these macroorganisms that you see on the slide, they help to carry that organic matter down deep into the soil profile. As they're burrowing down into the soil, then it creates a pathway for that humus or that organic matter to move down deeper into the profile. And then you just gradually get lower and lower. And that's how you get like that picture that shows that 3-foot depth of organic matter. It's done by all these guys here working to help bring that down deeper into the soil. And also when you plant certain deep rooted plants in the landscape, those roots are creating pathways breaking through the subsoil. And then as those plants decompose or those roots slough off, now we've got little pathways of organic matter down into the subsoil that gradually breaks that up, loosens it up, and allows more water and air down deeper into the root zone. Doesn't happen overnight, but if you're methodical and thoughtful about the process, then you can really make some progress. So these are all kind of the basic, the important reasons why I want to constantly be thinking about organic matter in the soil, because it's doing all these great things for us. And it's funny because these are all things that we can't see. But if we're, annually adding compost, adding mulches, aerating the soil,
Thank you for the cup of tea.
doing all these things to add organic matter, these are all the benefits that we're getting from it. So I can't cheerlead enough that addition of composts and other forms of organic matter are very important. Questions, Suma?
None so far.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to kind of change pace just a little bit and talk about soil fertility and how organic fertilizers, compost, etc., play into fertilization in the landscape. So these two diagrams are showing turf grass and the response rate to fertilizer. So the first picture here, it shows a 6-week time frame from the application of a fast release fertilizer. So this would be something that, if you go to the garden center and it says, green up overnight, quick green fertilizer, green it up, super green or whatever. That's what that is. That's a fertilizer that when you water it in, that it starts releasing instantly. But this is what we get with that is we apply at the red arrow, and then we get this kind of rocket ship green growth. And as soon as we've used up the nutrients and maybe the additional nutrients have leached into the subsoil or off of the soil profile, then just as fast it declines and it stops growing, which is something that we don't want. We don't want our plants to kind of get this jolt increase and then they're starving within a couple weeks. It makes for a plant that's very weak and very prone to stress. What we really want is this more of this down here. We want to be able to apply fertilizers less regularly and have a balance of soil in the profile that will kind of get you up here and really even to kind of prolong a steady amount of growth through the growing season. And that's going to make for a much healthier plant. Moving forward, it's going to be able to fight off insect and disease pressure if it's less stressed out. So there's so many reasons why we want to think about appropriate fertilizers and looking at a fast release versus a slow release type fertilizer. So just real quick, if we don't, spend a whole lot of time thinking about fertilizers, the one thing that is common on all fertilizers is that it will have an analysis of at least these top three macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. N, P, and K. Yeah, this thing. N, P, and K. So the first one on this fertilizer, if I flip the bag over, it says turf food 12-4-8. So that's 12% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 8% potassium. And those are, we call them macronutrients because those are the three nutrients that plants really depend on the most. But there's arguably 16 to 18 nutrients that plants have to have for successful, healthy plant growth. But it's these top three that are very important. But what we see on this fertilizer further than that is this has a 50% organic labeled here on it, which suggests that this is a slow release type nitrogen in the fertilizer. So this is going to do two things for us. One, it is going to green up fast, but then you've got this organic insoluble nitrogen added to this. It's just 3.6% water insoluble nitrogen, which suggests that it's going to start greening the plant up fast, but it's going to continue to feed and release gradually and slower so that you get a longer feeding effect from this fertilizer. So other forms of organic nitrogen, there's a lot of options out there. As far as just the base form, these are all kind of what's most typical. If you buy an organic fertilizer, if it says organic lawn food, and you flip the bag over, it's going to say derived from XYZ, and it's more than likely going to be some combination of these additives here to get you the nitrogen within those fertilizers. And then there are some synthetic forms of organic nitrogen that you will see pretty common on water, readily available forms of nitrogen in the soil. So really the thing to think about here is for your organic additives, look at the breakdown of these. Alfalfa, 3% nitrogen. Cottonseed meal, 7% nitrogen. Okay, so these are pretty low in their analysis, which alludes to us when we add this that, we're not adding so much at one time. Well, if we look at over here on these synthetic forms of nitrogen, 21%, 18%, and with urea at 46% nitrogen. So issues here, or any type of potential issue with using these synthetic forms of nitrogen versus these organic options.
So maybe if you use synthetic forms, there'll be a nitrogen burn.
Exactly. Yeah, we have the potential that we're putting way too much out at one time, and we're going to, potentially burn the plant with urea at 46%. This is uric acid. This can burn the plant itself, and it can burn the root system. So we end up causing a significant amount of plant stress. The other thing is that you just get this huge spike in growth and almost a plant toxicity. If they get too much of it, too much nitrogen, sometimes you'll see a lawn that looks kind of purplish colored, or really, really dark, almost blackish colored green. That is a lawn that has received way too much quick release nitrogen to the point where eventually it may look good and dark green now, but eventually that plant is going to show stress and yellow back out. So you got to be very, very careful with not over applying nitrogen. So if you're using these organic forms of nitrogen, it's very hard to do that. As this breaks down, it's going to release slowly the elements within this, and so you're going to really minimize the amount of plant stress by using these organic forms. So going along with that, with our nitrogen source category, slow available nitrogen versus readily available nitrogen, you can see kind of how these characteristics change. Response time, slow, so it's not so quick, versus quick here. And so each of these, you've got pluses and minuses with each of them. And so it's going to allude maybe to a strategy that I'm going to recommend here at some point. Okay. We have a question in there, Suma?
Yeah, there is a question, but this is not specific to soil. Somebody is asking, what fertilizer do you recommend for Japanese use?
Yeah, well, that is a good question. I don't have any specific recommendations for certain plant material, except the concept of us balancing the nutrient load in the soil. Okay. So you're going to say, well, that sounds complicated, but it's really not. We'll get to it at the end when we talk about soil analysis. That'll be very important because there's not a specific fertilizer for a Japanese yew or for a pittosporum or really anything. What we need to address the balance of nutrients and pH in the soil. And once we've done that, then hypothetically, we can grow any plant successfully and with vigor and health. So the first one we'll get into is pH, and I don't want you to turn into this student that spent the afternoon at the library learning about pH. But very short, this is the potential of the hydrogen ion within the soil, and it decides if our soil is going to be an acid or a base. This is a measurement of either the acidity or the alkalinity within the soil. Is based on a scale of 0 to 14, where 7 is neutral. So if we've heard about azalea or a blueberry, for instance, people would say, well, those plants need an acid soil. Well, that's what this means. That means that their soil needs to be less than 7. 7 is neutral. As we go less, 6, 5, 4.5, down that scale, then that becomes acid soil. And that's certain plants prefer that over a basic soil or an alkaline soil. The vast majority of plants prefer somewhere around neutral. And I'll expand on that a little bit with this slide. Ooh, lots of stuff here. Okay, but the simple thing about this diagram, which shows nutrient availability varying by soil pH. And if we see at the bottom, there's this 6.0 to 7.0, and that's what we would call the ideal pH for most plants. Most plants love to grow in a soil that has a pH from 6 to 7. Well, why is that? Why is that? Well, these are all of our basic elements in the soil that are necessary for plant growth. Okay, all these nutrients. And what this graph shows is that it shows the availability of those nutrients based off of the pH. So nitrogen, for instance, here. Okay, it is most available from a pH of 6 to 7.5. And then it tapers off. So even if a soil has a bunch of nitrogen in it, but the pH is 8.5, then that nitrogen is not available for the plant to use. It's tied up in the soil because of the power of the hydrogen ion. Easier way to say that is that it's like a sponge and the soil holds it. Okay, so as we get more alkaline or more acidic, that nitrogen might be there, but the soil won't let it go and it won't let the plant use it. So these two lines right here of the yellow suggest that if we look down the line, most of these nutrients that plants need are most available all right within that range. So that's why when we say 6.5 is kind of the magic number as far as soil goes. And so the soil analysis will give you that. Also, you can buy a little gauge. If you just want a regular reading, it's a pH gauge. You can buy them at a garden center for about $10 or $15, and it's going to say the pH is either acidic or alkaline or neutral. And so you can just stab that in the soil and you can get a quick reading. Those readings are not perfect, but at least it gives you kind of an idea of where you're at on that, on your pH. Any questions on this slide?
What is the best way to get a soil analysis done? I'm sure Boone is going to talk about it a bit later.
Yeah, that's what all this presentation is leading up to the fireworks show, which is me showing you how to conduct a soil analysis and how to read the analysis and make sense of it. So we will talk about that. Yeah, and so this little add-on here suggests that there are buffers to pH. So, I keep talking about organic matter right here, OM, organic matter. So the higher organic matter percentage that you have in your soil, it gives you a buffer so that even if you have a pH that may be less or higher than what is ideal, the more organic matter we have in the soil acts as a buffer, so it kind of spreads the range a little bit more for nutrient availability. So another good reason why we want to focus on and increase that level of organic matter in the soil.
So we have a couple of questions, Boone.
Mhm.
One is, what is peat moss? Would it help here in our area?
So most of the peat moss that we see in garden centers is imported from Canada, and this comes from bogs. Peat is is active in these deep bog soils. Sometimes if you go to East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and some of these boggy areas, there are peat bogs in the South, but the vast majority of it is imported from Canada. And so they go in there and they just dredge out these swampy areas, dry it, break it down, compact it into bales, and then ship it down here for us. So you might think environmentally, uh, there's some impacts there with that natural resource. It's one that I typically do not recommend because of the footprint. We're having to destroy these habitats, and then we have to process that and transport it down here to put into our gardens. So I typically don't recommend peat moss, particularly in a large scale situation. What somebody would say that it does, one, it adds organic matter, so that's a check mark, and that it has the ability to balance or even drop the pH a little bit in the soil. So if you have a alkaline soil, then we can add peat moss to it to maybe bring the pH down a little bit. But it's really not that significant to the point where we wouldn't just choose other organic matter sources that are more readily available. And really for us, it's waste materials that come into our soil processing centers in Southeast Texas, which is landscape refuse, tree branches, leaves, old landscape plants that are brought in, that are ground up and then composted. That's kind of a win-win because that would be waste material that would have gone into a landfill, but we're able to digest that down and then reincorporate that into gardens. So that's typically what I would recommend is just using a locally sourced compost that can either be bought in bulk or bought in bags from garden centers in the area.
So the other question is, would you fertilize your lawn differently based on the plants, trees around the area? That is, grass versus flower bed versus trees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Some plants, tend to be uh, ones that would want to be fertilized more regularly, or otherwise ones that would need to be fertilized more seasonally. So turf grass, for instance, we have southern turf varieties, and these are St. Augustine grass, zoysia, Bermuda, centipede, etc., that are actively growing during the summer months, during the warm months, but they're also dormant during the winter. And we want them to be dormant. They want to be dormant, and we want to try to keep them there. So that plays into kind of how we schedule fertilization for the lawn. We don't want to apply fertilizer during the winter months while it's dormant versus landscape beds that you have plants that may be evergreen, ground covers and perennial shrubs, etc., that really need more of a constant supply of nutrients. So that's going to impact how we think about fertilization in different areas. Would be to, know a little bit of information about the species and when it's growing. We want to fertilize, or we want fertility to be at its peak while those plants are growing. If they're dormant, we don't want to apply fertilizers to encourage them to come out of dormancy, where a lot of plants here want to sleep during the winter because it gets cold, and they end up getting freeze or frost damage if they're actively growing. If they're dormant, then those plants kind of have a winter blanket to guard them from freeze damage, But if we unintentionally add fertilizers and we kind of coax them into growing, and then we have a big cold front like this winter storm, Uri, then plants really become damaged because they weren't dormant. But the trees that we've seen, the grass that we've seen that was dormant during that winter storm, they didn't have a whole lot of problems coming out of dormancy at the right time, and really showed minimal amount of damages from the cold. So long answer there, but a lot of stuff to think about in that question. We have another one on there.
I think probably you may have already answered. Does the cage tell you the pH level?
The test. Oh, the gauge. Yeah, there's several different types of just quick snapshot gauges. Some of them, it's going to test for soil fertility. Some of them it's going to test for moisture content. Some of them are going to test for pH, and some of them will do all three of those in one. So it depends on you and what you're looking for. But again, those types of probes do not give you a very good analysis, but it does give you an idea. So if you put it in there and it shows the pH is like super acidic, then you know that you probably need to dig a little deeper into that, try to figure out what your pH is and how to adjust appropriately. So on this one here, talk about your primary and your secondary nutrients that we call our macro or big nutrients. These are the 6 that our plants use the most: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then we have all these micronutrients that kind of trickle down from there. But most of the time when we add a fertilizer, at minimum, it's going to have these 3. Sometimes we'll look on the back and it'll have calcium, magnesium, or sulfur. And then some of them will actually have listed some of your micronutrients. But at first, we definitely want to address these primary and secondary nutrients. And if we can get those kind of within balance in the soil, then again, hopefully our plants, every plant that we put out there is going to be very healthy. Do we have a question, Suma?
No.
Okay, so you're not a soil scientist. You don't want to be a soil scientist. So I've given you a crash course and kind of the basic stuff to be thinking about underground. We've talked about the chemistry, and we've talked about the biology in the soil. So a good way for us to capture that more appropriately is by soil sampling. Actually, by grabbing some of your soil from your yard or your flower beds, and we're going to take that and we're going to send it to a soil testing laboratory, and then they're going to send you back an analysis and a recommendation. And I'll go through those and we'll talk about them a little bit more in depth.
Okay, so we have another question.
Yeah.
Do eggshells decompose fairly fast to provide calcium?
No, they
No.
don't.
Yeah.
They don't. And so typically what we would recommend is that we compost those, and we will have a class that we do a deep dive into home composting, and we'll talk about stuff like that does tend to stay in the compost for some time. So we really want to, mix the compost, incorporate that into it, and gradually have it start to break down. But no, eggshells last a long time. So, adding them directly to the landscape is typically not a good idea. But putting them in the compost, trying to break them up a little bit before you put them in there. Don't put the 2 halves in. Crunch them up a little bit and put them in there, and that's going to help those worms, earthworms, and the peel bugs and beetle larvae, grubs, and things start to break that down. And once they break it down, then that calcium it becomes a smaller particulate that can become plant available.
What about coffee grinds for roses? One of the most popular ones.
Yeah. Yeah, coffee grounds are pretty good. They are acidic. So if you've got a soil that's 7.5, the addition of fresh coffee grounds is a pretty good idea. One, it does add organic matter. It's in a small particulate or particle size, so it does break down quickly, and it can acidify the soil some. So a lot of good benefits there. But but the bulk amount that you tend to get with coffee grounds, we tend to recommend that you add those into your compost
Mhm.
because that's a good additive. If we look at this recipe for compost, is that something that's already a small particle, so it kind of supercharges the microorganisms in the compost that helps start that process faster, so that you end up with a readily usable compost much faster. So put the coffee grounds in the compost, speed up that process, and then take all that material back into the garden when it's ready. Good question. Yeah, and I like coffee grounds because it smells good too. And so put that in your flower bed, and adds a nice fragrance if you like coffee, which I love
Yes.
coffee.
Yes. Um,
All
so
right, so
someone is asking
yeah,
that do crushed eggshells really help the tomato horn worms to go away?
no,
No,
they
that's what I
don't.
thought.
Yeah. So the concept with that was that the calcium deposits and the eggshells have a sharp edge to them, and as you get certain larvae, worms and caterpillars, etc., crawling over them, that it cuts their chitin and then they dry out. But no, unfortunately, the best way to get rid of tobacco or tomato hornworms is manually removing them. So it's going out in the morning real early or at dusk and just pulling those off the plants and discarding them, however most sinister you're capable of, just getting them out of there.
There's actually a good question. How often should we do a soil test?
Yeah, very good. Um, Fantastic question. So, um, for just a home landscape, um, every 3 years is probably a good idea because we're trying to consider big changes in the nutrient level of the soil. So, like the picture here in this lawn situation, that's not going to change very regularly. So every couple years, you should be fine. But if you've got a vegetable garden, for instance, where you're constantly disking the soil and adding nutrients to it as plants mature and die, then you're going to see some big fluctuations in your soil nutrient levels. So you may want to do a garden soil sample every year or two, but just in your lawn and in your flower beds, um, every 3 or 4 years is going to be sufficient. So as we say this here, we need to take time to conduct a really good sample, and we want the soil to be representative of an area. And basically, what that means is that like your lawn area, that's going to be one sample. And then if you have a flower bed or a shrub bed that's treated differently, you're putting mulch on it or compost or different types of fertilizers. If you treated the area differently in any way, or if the soil profile or texture is different, then those really need to be separate samples. So you might have, when you send them to the lab, it might be one is front yard, two front flower bed, backyard, fruit trees, vegetable garden. So hypothetically, you could have 5 or 6 samples that go off to the lab that are helping you to identify your fertilizer needs in each of those areas. So I've got a little video I'm going to try to show here in a second that goes through the process of how to do that. But once you send in the soil sample to the laboratory, so basically you conduct the soil sample, you gather it up, you bag it, you fill out the form, and then send in payment in a box, and you send that to the laboratory. We don't do that here at the county office. It goes to College Station, to the soil and water testing laboratory, and then they analyze it. They run it through a coefficient based off of what you're growing, and then they spit you back an analysis and a recommendation. So for instance, on this one here, the top left corner, it says crop grown garden. So this is a backyard vegetable garden, is where this soil sample is coming from. Okay, so a couple key things on this analysis I've highlighted in purple for your convenience. The top one up there, it says pH, the top bar here. It says pH, and the result on the pH is 8.1. And then it says here that this is moderately alkaline. So where we want our pH to be at 6.5, this one's a little high. It's basic. So we may want to think about ways that we can bring that pH down a little bit to get it to an acceptable level so that our plants are healthy. So that's one thing that we'll see on our results that we would want to look at. pH. So if your pH is lower than like 5.5, or it's higher than 8, then we want to think about ways that we can buffer our pH. So if you have a high pH, if it's alkaline, in this situation, we can add pelletized sulfur. And sulfur, regular additions of sulfur are going to help bring the pH down. And adversely, if your pH is acidic, if it's 6 or 5.5, we can add calcium or lime, and the lime will bring our pH up. Okay, so the addition of sulfur or lime is going to be able to help balance the pH up and down. And it's something that unfortunately has to be done regularly. You're never going to change the pH permanently. If your soil pH is 8.1 naturally, well, it's probably going to stay that way. Okay, but with it's kind of like taking a vitamin. You know, we have to keep taking a vitamin. We can't just take one. So it's the same thing here. If we want to keep that pH buffered down, then we have to add sulfur every year, or we have to add lime to bring it back down. Question, Suma?
Yes, there are a few questions.
Yeah.
How deep should you take the soil sample to test? Is there a tool that should be used?
Oh, that man. Yeah, I need to pay you for asking those questions. Hopefully, if my little video works, I'll answer both of those questions.
Okay. The next question is, what is the cost of the soil analysis?
Very good. So there, I can go on the lab website here in a minute, and I'll break it down. The minimum cost for one sample is $12 plus your shipping. So it's pretty reasonable. And that gives you your pH, and that gives you your macronutrients. So for somebody who's never soil sampled before, it gives you really the base stuff that you need. Like in this sample, this one is testing for macronutrients, and it's testing for organic matter. So if you want to know your organic matter percentage, then you need to check that option. It costs a little bit more. I think it's maybe $25 a sample to get your organic matter percentage added to the sample. But for $12, it gives you pretty much all you need to get started. It gives you your pH and it gives you all your macronutrients. And I'll go to the website here in a minute and I'll show you how to find that. But a couple other things here. One is these are all your nutrients. And then this graph here shows you kind of the quantity. And this CL that's on here, that stands for critical level. And so the critical level is basically, if we're below that, that means we have a deficiency in that mineral. If we're right above it, then we're doing great. If we're way over here, then we have an overabundance in that, and that's not good. We don't want an overabundance in anything because that starts messing up the chemistry of the soil and causes those minerals to bond up with other minerals that makes them harder to be released for plants to absorb. So what the most important thing with this is going to, why we would spend time thinking about a fertilizer type. Okay, so let me use this as an example. This purple bar here says nitrate or nitrogen. And nitrogen is arguably the most important element in the soil for plant growth. Plants need it for cell division, for putting on new stems and leaf growth. Without nitrogen, plants just don't really grow. And so we look at this sample and we see the graph level. There's only one bar here. And it's right down here by the N on none. Is that good? Suma, what do you think?
Sorry, I missed that.
It's not good. It's not good. We need a lot of nitrogen. And this soil sample here says we basically have none. So we need to add a lot of nitrogen to get up to this critical level.
Yeah.
So the fertilizer recommendation, it says that we need 1.3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And we don't need anything else. Zero. Okay. So let me say this. So when we go to a box store and we buy a fertilizer without knowing this information, that fertilizer probably has equal amounts of phosphorus, potassium, some calcium, magnesium, etc., all in there. We call that a complete fertilizer. But according to this soil analysis, everything else is good. We don't need it. All we need is some nitrogen. So we need a nitrogen fertilizer just by itself. We add that to this amount and then we're good. Everything else gets balanced on here and we should have healthy plants. We should have healthy plants if we apply 1.3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet in this soil profile. We don't need other stuff. So if we add a fertilizer that has phosphorus and potassium, then this level is going to keep going up. And when it gets too high, then that starts messing up the chemistry in the soil. It starts bonding up the other elements. And I've seen some samples where the phosphorus and the potassium levels are off the chart. In the lab, we'll even put a little note at the bottom that says, do not add any more phosphorus. Do not add any fertilizers that have phosphorus for 5 to 10 years. Something as drastic as that says, quit doing this because you are, one, causing plant health issues, and two, if we have way too much of something, more than likely those minerals are being leached out into our creeks and waterways, and that's where you see algae bloom down in the bayou next to your house. It's typically because with a lot of fertilizers that are in overabundance and end up leaching down into our watershed. So we want to try to stay as close to this critical level as possible. Right here, they've tested for organic matter. At the bottom left, the purple bar says 5.14%. That is beautiful. If you can keep 5% organic matter in your soil profile, you are doing amazing things. Because if I go back and I look at that pie graph that shows how soil is broken down, that one little wedge, that skinny little wedge, was about 5%, 5 to 6, 7%. That's maxing out the amount of organic matter. If you do that and it says 0.5 or 1%, well, I would recommend that you find some ways to get more compost, to get more organic matter, organic fertilizers into the soil to try to bring that percentage up towards 5%.
So there is a question based on this. There's a it shows very high level of calcium. So is there a need to buffer the high calcium in the soil, or will it correct itself?
Yeah, that level there is not to the point that's causing a whole lot of problem, but we could directly correlate this high level of calcium to our alkaline pH. Calcium basically is equivalent to lime in the soil. So if our soils naturally have a high calcium, they tend to be basic or alkaline. So we can't really bring that down, but we can try to buffer this soil with some sulfur, additional sulfur, granulated sulfur, like Dispersol is a product that's you commonly see in the garden centers. It's not going to impact this a whole lot here, but annually adding sulfur may help buffer that pH down just a little bit. If you can get this soil down to a 7.5, that would be a good thing. But 8.1, it's a little high. I wouldn't be happy with my results from my plants with a pH of 8.1.
Okay. So, okay, you're going to show the video of the soil test actually?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna try to, let's see, close that. And we're gonna see if this plays here. Are you ready?
Yes.
Hello, we're here in Sugar Land, Texas today, and we're going to do a short demonstration on how to conduct a soil sample. A couple basic tools that you want to have to get started. Pretty simple stuff. First one is just a good set of garden gloves so we don't get too messy. Next one here is a trusty garden knife to help us do a little bit of soil work if we need to. This one right here is a soil probe. And so this probe is going to be able to help us go down to grab a core out of the soil. If you don't happen to have one of these, not a big problem. Instead, we could use a spade shovel and we can get a sample just as good. A couple other things that we've got right here is just some type of a little board or some type of flat, clean surface to mix your soil sample on, and a bag. We do provide these fancy little soil sample bags, but you do not have to use this. You can simply send in your sample in a Ziploc bag. Okay, so for us to conduct a good sample, we have to create a zone or a sample area. And what we want to do is we want to choose an area that has the same soil structure. This whole bed here has the same color. It's probably been treated similarly with fertilizers and other additives. So we can be able to call this one zone. The bed next to it over here may be quite different. So we would want to test that as its own separate sample. But even within this one bed right here, we need to take about 10 small core samples and then from the whole bed, and then we'll bring those together and we'll aggregate those into one sample that goes into the lab. Okay, so here we are. We're going to start defining our sample here. So with our probe, all we got to do is we're going to try to go down roughly 6 inches of depth on there to get our full depth probe. And we'll take that and it should just drop right out. And that gives us our 6-inch piece. And as I've taken some other ones here, we'll take about 10 of those together. Again, if we don't have the probe, we can do a similar thing with the shovel. So all we need to do with it is we dig one side of a hole about 6 or 7 inches, come back the other way, about the same depth, and we're going to try to pull out the centerpiece there. Back that down, and then take your shovel, go back 1 inch, and take this like a slice of cake. And we're going to end up with that, about 6 inches deep. Okay? So within this, we use our knife, cut the sides off of it, and then that gives us one piece. We're trying to get it the 6 inches of depth, an even amount through the whole piece. So either way we do it, we'll take about 10 of these, and once we get it on here, we're just going to break it up. And the first thing to do once we've broken it up on here is look around if there's pieces of wood chips or pieces of large rocks, plant debris. We want to remove those from the sample because that's not going to help anything but the test being analyzed. So you just want a good looking soil there. Okay, and then from that, once we've aggregated it together, we take our bag. On our soil sample bag, it has a line here. It tells you how full we need the bag to be. If you don't give enough soil, if you're short of that, there's a possibility they wouldn't be able to get a good analysis off of it. So just take this stuff, fill it up to the designated level. So looking at it from the side, we've got the right depth. You just wrap that up. That one's ready to go. Okay, a couple things that you want to have with you to get the soil sample mailed off to the laboratory. First off here, this is a publication that you can request from Extension on how to test your soil. It goes through this process that I'm showing you today. It also shows you how to package it appropriately with your payment and how to get it to the lab right. That's just good instructions. Along with that, you'll need to download the soil sample form. This is for urban and homeowner soil analysis. The information on here is pretty straightforward and described pretty well in this publication. And you'll simply take that and fold that up once it's complete with your payment. And then put that in a small box here. You want something that's kind of rigid so that your sample doesn't fall apart in the mail. So we'll take the application form, put that in there. On the soil sample bag, it says sample ID. If you're sending in multiple samples at one time, you want to ID those. Bed 3, front yard, backyard, and so forth, so you remember which one is which. Also, it says put your name on here. That's in case they get them mixed up in the soil lab, they know where to put it. So all that information is on the bag, and you just drop that in here, package it up, and send it to the lab.
All right. So that's pretty simple from beginning to end, but I can kind of show you here on this website. Okay, so this website here is soiltesting.tamu.edu, and this is our soil, water, and forage testing laboratory website. And if we, it's not the fanciest website by any means, but it has everything that we need. So we scroll down to the bottom on the publications over here. If I click on that, testing your soil, This was the publication that I referenced in the video. It just goes through 4 pages, shows you how to do the whole process. Very simple from beginning to end. And the submittal forms, you click on this for homeowner, landscape, and home garden. We're going to do this. It says urban soil submittal form. And it's going to download the PDF. And let me open that up real quick. And I'll go through and I'll show you some of the components within the form. Oh, where'd it go? There it is. Okay, so top stuff here is just information about you, information about your payment, how you want to make payment to the for the sample. And then here, okay, so I'm like I mentioned, the sample ID, we could call it front yard, backyard, vegetable garden, whatever. The amount of square footage, the last time that you fertilized, and then maybe if you know what type of fertilizer you used, just put that on here. And then over here where it says I am growing, we will just reference down here at the bottom. It says from azaleas to camellias, vegetables, turf grass, pecan trees, shrubs, etc. We would just put in what we're growing. So let's just say St. Augustine grass. So we put an H in this box. I'm growing H, and this is my front yard sample. And then over here, the requested analyses, you just check which one you want. And as I mentioned earlier, we can get a whole lot of information, or we can just get the base. So this number 1 is your routine analysis. This gives you your pH, and this gives you all of your macronutrients in the sample, and it's $12. Very simple. Most situations, this is what I recommend. But as you go up in cost, as you can see, you get more detailed analysis as you move up. And this would be really more for like landscape managers and maybe greenhouse operators, etc., that really needed some details in there to adjust their nutrients. But for us, a good start is your routine. If you wanted to geek out a little bit, I might suggest your routine plus your micronutrients, because this adds in a little bit more, some additional nutrients that if they are in a deficiency, then you can apply some of those separately. So what you just fill this form out, you put your payments in there, and then they will send you back your analysis. And so further than that, if we go back to this, the home page for the soil lab, then we can kind of dig into like a fertilizer calculator, like this one here, urban fertilizer calculator. So you can take in what they give you. So like the sample said, we needed, what was it say, 3 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And if we put in just a nitrogen fertilizer, then that tells me really quickly that I need 14.3 pounds of this nitrogen fertilizer per 1,000 square feet. It does the math for you. You just put the numbers in and it spits it out. So if I go buy a 2100 fertilizer and I measure the square footage of my lawn, then I need to add 14 pounds of that fertilizer for every 1,000 square foot of space. So pretty simple and pretty easy way to make sure that we're putting out just the right amount of fertilizer, not any less or not any more. Got a couple web resources here to show you. Again, one, the Earthkind Landscaping Program. If we go to the Aggie Horticulture website, or we can just type in earth-kind.tamu.edu. This website has a ton of good information here. We can go through all the components of the website and a lot of additional learning for you. Everything from water conservation, mulches, composts, plant selection, etc. All the good stuff on here. Our extension here in Fort Bend County, this is our main hub. So to learn more about everything else that we do in extension in Fort Bend County, it's fortbend.agrilife.org. And so we've got go through all these tabs here, kind of lead the way. You can go to contact, and it lists our office contact information, plus the information on each of us here in the office. And so that's me right down here. You can click on this for my email address if you want to reach out with a follow-up question. And last but not least, we have the homepage for our fantastic Fort Bend County Master Gardeners. This is a great resource as well. Everything that has to do with horticulture here in Fort Bend County. And tabs along here shows the events that we've got going on, statewide resources, and then we've got an assortment of Fort Bend specific resources that we have been compiling gradually for your use. So check it out. Lots of cool stuff there. And I'm going to stop my screen share.
So this one question, I think this is relevant to everybody. What's the typical turnaround time for the soil test?
Yeah, very good question. I had some fantastic questions today. But this one is going to change throughout the year. So the soil lab tends to get bogged down in February and March because everybody's kind of wanting to get ready for spring. And similarly in August and early September, we have a little peak there because people are getting ready for the winter garden. And so try to stay out of those time frames, but I'd say at minimum length is 1 week turnaround. If you pick a good time of the year, like midwinter or midsummer, while nobody else is thinking about it, then you can slide in there, and then the lab will get your soil sample done very fast and get it back to you real quick. But if it's during the peak time frame, sometime it can be 2 to 3 weeks. Other questions?
I think that's about it for now. I don't see any other questions. So if you have any questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask them, or you can put them in the chat. We have just a couple more minutes.
Yes, I did have a question. Do you have any suggestions in terms of the freeze which has taken place in the recent times? Just about everything seems frozen up and turned brown.
Mm-hmm.
What is your suggestion in terms of holding on till mid-June or end of June to figure out something is to survive, or?
Yeah, very good question. So we've been, telling people just to hold off, but honestly, by the middle of May, if you're not seeing those landscape plants start to sprout out at the base or somewhere within the canopy, then it's probably too late. And stuff like citrus, stuff like avocados, bottle brush, Japanese blueberry. There's some shrubs and plant material that we've looked around, and the vast majority of those are shot. But there are some shrubs like Indian hawthorn and pittosporum, etc., that look really bad. But if you get in there and kind of look down into the canopy, more than likely you're going to see some green up and some new shoots down in the plant. So pretty soon, I'd say probably by May 1st, you're going to know where it's time to cut and where to cut at on those plants, and go ahead and prune those things back and add compost and mulch. Water those plants, because where we don't want to overwater, soil moisture is crucial in helping plants respond to freeze damage. If they're trying to grow and there's not adequate soil moisture, then they're just stuck there. And the longer they sit there without putting on new growth, the chances of them responding start to diminish. So make sure you water, don't overwater, but keep the soil a good level of moisture in the soil. Make sure you've got fertility for the plants to grow. Addition of compost and mulches help to kind of spur on that process of plant growth and root improvement. So I guess the answer there has been to wait, but at some point pretty soon we're going to move past the wait, identify where the plants are, prune them back if you see some growth at the base. If you don't see anything down there within the next week or two, then unfortunately, you need to get those plants out of there and then be thinking about your plan for replanting. I would advise
I,
you, if you go to any of the local nurseries right now, is to bring a helmet and some elbow pads with you, because it's a feeding frenzy at the nurseries.
yeah,
Yes.
And
I had a quick follow up on another question, which is Master Gardeners offered strawberry papayas and sugar apples, and I'm wondering, are those feasible growth plans for Houston or
well,
Fort Bend?
yeah, that's a very good question. So, based off of demand of tropicals, subtropicals, and maybe what we call marginal fruit trees, uh, people are really wanting to grow a diversity of non-typical fruits. But anytime that we've sold those plants, it comes with a significant disclaimer that there's limitations to those plants. That during freeze or deep freeze, even that we need to protect those plants. And so there's a little gamble with all the kind of assortment of obscure tropical fruits. But if we we got hit by this 10-degree weather, which is very atypical for us. So I think if we did a calculation of the percentage of suitable time, it'd be like 99.9% of the time our weather is conducive to grow tropical fruits. It's just that
Oh, that's good to know.
0.01% time and chance that throws us off. And so that kind of brings us to a kind of a philosophical response that, one person would say, I'm not going to grow papayas or citrus again because they freeze here. Well, if we look at historically when we get these freezes of record, I could plant another citrus tree and looking at the numbers, it's going to be 20 to 30 years before we get another hard freeze again. So I'm going to, hypothetically, I'll get plenty of years out of a replacement plant if I want to do it again. So some people are going to say, get away from tropicals. They're not good here. We just want to go to natives and durable plants. Or somebody else could say, hey, I don't care. I'm going to plant it. I'm going to enjoy it. And if it freezes, I'm going to dig it up and I'm going to replant me another one because I like doing it. So it's all up
How
to,
tall these two particular species grow? The sugar apples and strawberry papayas.
well, yeah, they are tropicals and they are not cold tolerant. So there are ones that either need to be protected, planted in containers where you can, move them into the garage as necessary. But just out in the landscape, That's one that, it comes with a disclaimer that if you can't cover it during a deep freeze, then it's gonna be compromised. Did you want to add to that, Suma?
No, I just wanted to remind you that we are running overtime.
Yeah.
So, and
Oh, it's just a little Q&A. If there's any other questions, I don't mind answering them.
and also like for the fruit trees, like our speaker will touch upon the tropical and semi-tropical, subtropical fruit trees when we do the fruit trees for home gardens class in detail. So,
Deep dive for sure.
yes.
Could I ask you, I bought a papaya and a Meyer lemon tree this spring, and the papaya came with 3 plants in the pot. I'm thinking of transplanting it to a bigger pot and keep it in pot so I can protect them if we get really bad weather. But should I plant those 3 shoots together?
Well, the problem that you'll get into there is some transplant shock because their root systems are all kind of bound together. And so papaya is one that doesn't really like to be fumbled around with. So if you try to divide those out, there's a chance, well, they're going to go into stress, some type of a shock, transplant shock because of that. But there's also a chance that they may not make it because they're having to kind of get over this shock, get rerouted and reestablished. And so typically if you buy a plant with multiple stalks in it, the best thing to do is just leave them there together, but give them plenty of room. If you're going to put them into a larger container, make sure there's enough soil in there, or if you're going to plant it in the ground, that there's ample amount of root space for all 3 of those trunks to be able to grow successfully.
Thank you very much for answering my question.
You're welcome. Any others?
There was one last one. Victor said he lost a couple of plants for root rot. And is there any way to remove the pathogen from the soil?
Mm-hmm. This is Vic. Hey, Vic. Um,
I know.
the answer to that is really no. There are some organic products that are available that try to kind of battle. Um, you're adding good microorganisms to battle the bad ones in the soil profile. Is it a silver bullet? No. Those pathogens are going to be there as long as there's a suitable host. So if we stop growing the plant that particular pathogen wants to invade, then gradually it diminishes because it doesn't have a vector or food source. But as long as we're growing plants there and that's in the soil, then hypothetically it'll always be in the soil and we never really get rid of it. Now we can add some of these organic stimulators to maybe safeguard the plants a little bit, but I don't think we ever 100% get rid of detrimental soil pathogens.
Yeah, Deborah has answered the same thing.
Thanks, Deb.
And this probably is the last question because we need to wrap up. Do we need to add any fertilizer other than compost and mulch periodically?
Oh, wow. Who asked this question?
Who asked the question?
So
It is from Anand Nair.
this is a really good question. It's one that I didn't really get to. I meant to get to. So I typically recommend what I consider a hybrid fertilization approach. So when you get that soil sample and the nitrogen is way down low, you're not gonna be able to add enough compost and organic matter to get that level all the way back up. So you'll need to add some type of synthetic nitrogen to get us up to that critical level. But besides for that, the regular addition of composts, of organic fertilizers are a great idea to keep the soil balance moving forward steadily. But if we have like a big deficiency in one particular nutrient, then we usually need to respond, beefing that up with some type of single additive. So if you go to a garden center, they're going to have potash, or they're going to have triple phosphate, or they're going to have nitrogen, like ammonium sulfate. And each of those individually helps you get that one number way up. But I would recommend, annually 1 or 2 applications of composts or organic fertilizers, in addition to using these synthetic nutrient additives to bring the balances back up. Very good question.
Thanks
Any
a lot for your
others?
time.
Hey, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us. We were pretty happy. I know Christina's happy with the attendance today. We've done a lot of library programs, and for me, this is a record in attendance. So thanks everybody for being here. Again, I showed you where to find my email address. So if you've got follow-up questions, I'm sitting right here in my office, so you can shoot me an email or call us, and we would be glad to answer your questions. Also, on Fort Bend Master Gardeners, the fbmg.org website, you can click on Contact Us, and it has information to our hotline. So we've got a group of question wranglers in our Master Gardener hotline that are eager to help you out with your gardening needs. So if there's no more questions, then I think we did a good job.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for coming. And if you want more programs like this, we're going to continue the Landscape Success Series on May 25th with the workshop Right Plants and Right Place. Registration will open April 25th, so in a few days. And registration will be open all the way up until the end of that event. And of course, it is an ongoing series, so keep an eye out for that. If you want more programs like this, let me go ahead and put the library website in the chat, where you went to register before, and that is www.fortbend.lib.tx.us. This session was recorded, and so should be a copy available, and we'll let you know when that happens. Other than that, thank you guys so very much for spending your afternoon with us. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Boone.
Christina and Boone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suma and Boone. This was great. Thanks, Mac.
Great to see everybody.